of all, I just want to say that I have been really looking forward to this for a long time. This is by far probably the most important subject in Christian apologetics, and I'm really happy that we have a chance tonight to go really in detail. We're not going to go all the way in detail, but we're going to go into detail for sure. And I just want to say up front too that this subject, I would say about 6 years ago, I guess it was about 2010 or 2009 or so. At that point in my life, I was still really kind of doubting my salvation in terms of, I guess because I always grew up in church. I didn't have a salvation experience that really like turned my whole life around, because I was saved when I was 11. And so I kind of grew up through middle school and high school and on into college, really believing, but kind of doubting my salvation. And then it eventually came to the point where in about 2009 or 2010, I was doubting my salvation to the point where I was beginning to doubt even the historicity of Jesus and the Bible, specifically the New Testament itself. And it wasn't until I picked up the book, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus by Gary Habermas and Mike Licona, and I didn't even make it all the way through that book before I was like, okay, this is just silly. And I was completely convinced, and I've been sold completely on Christianity ever since, and really learned a lot about apologetics since then. And that was the same time that I really became assured of my salvation. I felt like the Holy Spirit really moved in me at that time. And I was at the University of West Georgia at that time. So this is a really important topic, not just for everybody, but just for me personally as well. So I'm also going to say that the way that this works, as far as the evidence for the resurrection goes, this is a historical and a philosophical argument. Because the way that this works is we have historical data that indicates to us that the resurrection or the events surrounding the resurrection happened. And then what we do is we use that data to determine what is the best explanation for it. And it takes good reasoning and logic to weed through the possible explanations for what could explain all these sets of data. And the way that I've seen this presentation done before, the way I've seen tons of people do this kind of presentation before, is they always start like with the Gospels themselves, like with the Bible. And I decided I'm going to try something a little different this time, and I'm going to do it the other way around. So we're going to approach this from more of a, I don't know, I like to think of it as an Indiana Jones explorer kind of position, where let's just assume for a moment that we're just kind of exploring the first century world, and we just want to know like what happened, what was going on in Jerusalem in the first century. And so I'm going to begin with Flavius Josephus. Now, how many of you have heard enough about this subject and know enough about, and have probably heard the name Josephus enough to know what's wrong with Josephus?
He was a temple priest, was he not, in the Jewish temple?
He was a court historian for Emperor Vespasian.
Right, but before that, I think he was a priest in the temple, and after the conquest of Jerusalem, he actually turned on the priesthood and gave over his colleagues in the temple, and he was rewarded by the emperor becoming a historian, and he actually modified what he probably would have said before his new job to fit the agenda of the Roman group. Yeah.
What he said here?
No, I'm just saying that's.
Oh, okay, I got it. Okay, I gotcha. Well, that's not actually what I was talking about. I was talking about the validity of what he wrote in his Antiquities about Jesus. I'm sure if there were any hardcore skeptics in here, they would choke by saying that Josephus is my first slide. And here's the reason why. Well, let's read it first of all. So he wrote. Now he's a historian. This is what he wrote. Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him. For he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day.
Sounds like the typical Jewish perspective, right?
Yeah, exactly. No. Josephus was a Jew. And the fact that he would speak so favorably about Jesus in this passage makes a lot of skeptics raise their eyebrows. And so the question is, okay, was this manuscript somehow tampered with? Okay, now this is an extra biblical source. This is from his Antiquities. So the question becomes, well, what do we do if it was tampered with? Well, fortunately, scholars have done enough research into this quote where we can see what he probably would have said without the contested segments. So here is the quote again without the contested segments, and we have more of a, I guess you could call it a secular perspective of Jesus. So about this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, for he was one who wrought surprising feats and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. When Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men of the highest standing amongst us, had condemned him to be crucified, those who had in the first place come to love him did not give up their affection for him, and the tribe of the Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not disappeared. This is kind of a better, I guess, interpretation of what Josephus probably actually wrote about Jesus and the Christians and Pilate. Most scholars will agree that this text right here is a good historical source for Jesus, for Pilate, and for the early Christians, and also for the crucifixion. And what I'm about to show you is a bunch more quotes from other historians who are going to say similar things, record similar things. It's worth noting that as far as the Josephus passage is concerned, there is a 10th century Arabic translation of this passage right here that was translated from the Greek that, unlike this version, actually preserves what was written about, it preserves the resurrection. Let's see here. Yeah, the omissions are due to seeming too favorable towards Christianity, but Josephus writes about other New Testament events and characters as well. So if we take that this is what he actually wrote about Jesus, and it's unbiased, it's straightforward, we can also look at what he wrote about other people in the New Testament. He wrote about Herod and John the Baptist. He wrote about how Herod killed John. Josephus also wrote about Jesus' brother James, who was, Festus was now dead, and Albinus was but upon the roads. We assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others. Josephus also writes about Caiaphas the high priest. He writes about Herod's brother Philip. He writes about Ananias the high priest, and he writes about King Agrippa. All of these characters are found in the New Testament. So, the picture, imagine you only picked up a copy of Antiquities and you were looking around and digging around for maybe some things that happened in first century Jerusalem, and you run across these passages. You're actually going to get kind of a good story, kind of a good highlights of who Jesus was, at least who his followers were, who John the Baptist was. There's actually a very lengthy quote about John the Baptist, and I'll just say that it's actually really accurate as in terms of what John the Baptist preached in the Bible. It matches up a lot. It's kind of glazed over, but it's still very similar, particularly the doctrine of baptism and all of But the whole point of me mentioning these other parts of Josephus is to say that even the parts in Josephus about Jesus are not so easily dismissed, because we have these other unbiased and objective facts about these first century characters. So again, because Josephus wrote about all of them, and at least wrote this much about Jesus, if not the other part. I mean, who knows? Maybe he was kind of an admirer of Jesus. You know, maybe he was. It might have gotten him in a little bit of trouble, but
Wasn't Josephus the lone survivor of Masada?
I don't know.
I think he survived Masada, and I mean, Jesus, you might have viewed him as kind of a revolutionary against Rome type thing.
Yeah. So the point is like, scholars agree, like, this is reliable. This is reliable. This is something that a Jewish historian wrote. So moving on, we have Thallus, who was quoted in, this is actually a quote of a quote, in Chronicle from around 800 AD. Georgius Syncellus quotes Julius Africanus in his History of the World, and then Julius Africanus quotes Thallus, and that quote comes from, actually it's not even a quote, it's a description of a quote, which really frustrates a lot of scholars. But what Africanus is discussing is the unusual darkness that happened at Jesus' crucifixion. So notice here that, I mean, there's two facts here, or really I guess three, that Jesus was a real person, that he was crucified, and on the day of his death there was a strange darkness. Okay? Africanus is actually trying to disprove what Thallus wrote about. He's trying to disprove Thallus' theory about the darkness. Thallus was arguing that it was due to that the darkness was due to a solar eclipse. Africanus argues that that is probably not the case because he couldn't find any astronomical evidence for it at the time. He said that it was induced by God because the Lord happened then to suffer. So,
since they know it happened at the Passover, by the way, they know it cannot have been a solar eclipse.
yeah. And I'm going to
Because you
mention
can't
that.
have a solar eclipse during the full moon.
Yeah, I'm going to mention that a little later too. But this is also worth pointing out too, is if Thallus' reference is accurate, then his reference would predate the Gospel of Mark. And the Gospel of Mark is dated 66 to 70 AD, is around the time of its authorship. And that's really important. So let's think about this for a moment. We haven't even touched the Bible yet. Like, we haven't even, I've said some things about it, but whatever. All we're talking about right now is what we have from Josephus and Thallus. This was that Jesus was a real man. He was a wise teacher. He had followers called Christians. John the Baptist was a real guy. He preached some stuff, and Herod killed him. Jesus had a brother named James who got in some trouble with some Roman people. And Thallus writes that Jesus was crucified and that there was a strange darkness after his crucifixion. Now, if we don't know anything about the Bible, we might actually kind of piece all this together and go, what the heck happened? What happened when this Jesus guy was crucified? Tacitus, who wrote between 55 and 120 AD, he writes, consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero, his Emperor Nero, fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition. Thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. He's a real cheery guy. He's writing about Nero, who was persecuting Christians. And Nero ruled, we know for a fact, just because we have Roman history, we have all kinds of Roman history. that he ruled from 54 to 68 AD. So we know that he was persecuting Christians. And it's funny because actually in our Latin class just this week, our professor was talking about how Nero would crucify people at his banquet and then set them on fire to light the banquet.
Yeah.
Well, actually, what he didn't mention in class was those people were Christians, because I have the quote that comes right after this. Literally, right after this, he says, "Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt, to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired. Nero offered his gardens for the spectacle." See, this was something they did for fun. All right, now we have Pliny the Younger, the Roman governor of Bithynia and Asia Minor. He was writing to Emperor Trajan. The Christians were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang in alternate verses a hymn to Christ as to a God, and bound themselves by a solemn oath not to any wicked deeds, but never to commit any fraud, theft, or adultery, never to falsify their word, nor deny a trust when they should be called upon to deliver it up, after which it was their custom to separate and then reassemble to partake of food, but food of an ordinary and innocent kind. One interesting note is that the reason he's called Pliny the Younger is because Pliny the Elder was his uncle, and his uncle died in the Mount Vesuvius eruption in 79 AD. I just think it's cool that we know all these things about these people who were writing about the Christians, were writing about Jesus. And it's just really important to note here that this guy wrote that the Christians were singing hymns to Christ as to a God. This is an extremely early reference to Jesus being worshipped as God. I just want to emphasize again that we haven't even touched the Bible yet. I'm going to touch it. So, I mean, can anybody give a brief summary, I guess, of just some of these facts so far that we have?
Jesus exists.
Jesus existed.
He was crucified.
He was crucified.
His followers were Christians.
People worshipped him as God.
People worshipped him as God. His followers were Christians. They were persecuted. Yeah. It's books. All right, so remember, Pliny was writing to Trajan. Trajan responded back. The method you have pursued, my dear Pliny, is sifting the cases of those denounced to you as Christians is extremely proper. It is not possible to lay down any general rule which can be applied as the fixed standard in all cases of this nature. No search should be made for these people. When they are denounced and found guilty, they must be punished. With the restriction, however, that when the party denies himself to be a Christian and shall give proof that he is not, that is, by adoring our gods, he shall be pardoned on the ground of repentance, even though he may have formerly incurred suspicion. So we know that Christians could have dodged persecution and death by denouncing their God and adoring human gods. All right, Lucian was a 2nd century satirist. He was also a very happy guy. He wrote, "The Christians, you know, worship a man to this day, worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. You see, these misguided creatures start with the general conviction that they are immortal for all time, which explains the contempt of death and voluntary self-devotion which are so common among them, and then it was impressed on them by their original lawgiver that they are all brothers from the moment that they are converted and deny the gods of Greece and worship the crucified sage and live after his laws. All this they take quite on faith, with the result that they despise all worldly goods alike, regarding them merely as common property." Now the funny thing here is that Lucian is actually making fun of the Christians, but the irony is that the preservation of his text actually helps us out a lot, because it gives us a lot of clues as to what was going on. I mean, this is outright. Christians, they worship their crucified sage. And he's a man. He's a man. There were some other dudes who wrote about stuff, and I'm not going to go through and read all of theirs. But there's also the Jewish Talmud, mentions Yeshua being crucified. Mar Serapion of Syria wrote about the Jews' wise king being executed by them, but the wise king lived on in his teachings. He's actually writing wisdom to his son. And he's actually encouraging him to model himself after the Jews' wise king. He's not necessarily being executed, but
Who was Bar Seraphim?
I don't have
Syria.
it. I don't have
Other
it.
dude.
There's another dude, yeah.
Suetonius wrote about Christus. There is some debate about whether Christus is actually a reference to Jesus. It probably was. There are plenty of misspellings in ancient texts, and this is one possible one. And plus, according to the source that I was reading, sometimes the Romans, when they would write, would write phonetically. So if the verb sounded close enough to what they wanted, that they would just use that verb anyway. So, whatever. Emperor Hadrian, writing to the Asian proconsul Fundanus, gave advice about how to properly try and convict Christians. All great stuff. So, again, I want to emphasize, we haven't even touched the Bible at this point. We have not read anything from the Bible at this point. But this is what we have. There was a wise man / teacher named Jesus / Christus who performed miracles, was crucified by Pontius Pilate, somewhere between 26 and 36 AD. During the reign of Tiberius, who ruled from 14 to 37 AD, the crucifixion was accompanied by an unusual darkness. A mischievous superstition from Judea was the belief of the Christians. Christians met on a fixed day to pray, worship, and eat. Christians worshipped the man Jesus as God. Christians were asked to denounce their God. Christians were willing to die for their beliefs. Christians were being persecuted as early as 64 AD by Nero. We got all that from just history. Now, the details are kind of scant, but there is enough here to... Can you imagine if we didn't have the Bible and this was all we had? Something tells me that historians would be looking all over the place to figure out what was going on here. Like, what were this unusual turn of events? Where did these Christians come from? I mean, even if they went away after maybe 100 or 200 years, I think that historians would still be digging. They would be saying, who was this Jesus guy, and why did they worship him, and what kind of things did he say? Why was he crucified? So here we're going to start getting into, finally, some of our more specific sources. Thankfully, we have sources that are more specific. We call them the Gospels: Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. This is, at present, the oldest piece of the Bible, or the New Testament that we have. This is John. This is the papyrus P52. Let's see here. Yeah, it's John 18:31 through 33, roughly in pieces. Dates to 125 to 170 AD. That's when this piece was written. This is according to my research, this is the second oldest manuscript. There are 104 pages of the Pauline epistles in Papyrus 46, and that dates to 175 to 225 AD. And in terms of history, that is awesome. That is so good. Let me read you the list of, the Betty Papyrus contains major portions of Romans, Hebrews, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Ephesians, Galatians, Philippians, Colossians, and 1 Thessalonians in that order. Consider all the information that is in all of those epistles. Particularly take into account 1 Corinthians, because we're going to come back to 1 Corinthians a good bit, and also Galatians. So the fact that the earliest manuscripts we actually have that we can date go back to 175 to 225 is incredible in historical terms. We have 5,686 Greek New Testament manuscripts. Here's Papyri 66. It's almost all of the book of John. It's dated to around 100 to 200 AD. somewhere in there. There are 24,000 manuscripts if you include the 19,000 Syriac, Latin, Coptic, and Aramaic manuscripts. The manuscripts are 99.5% consistent with each other. So all these, when skeptics say to you, oh well, you know, all our manuscripts are all so different, we can't really trust like which is the right version and which is it's actually total baloney because they're 99.5% consistent, and the inconsistencies really boil down to like misspellings and rearrangements of words and maybe some things were left out here and there. But the fact is it doesn't really matter that much. Nearly all historical scholars agree that the New Testament was entirely written in the first century. Yes.
It's worth noting, we know how a lot of those little discrepancies got in because sometimes scribes who were transcribing would write little notes in the margins, just like complaining. It was really laborious before you had printing presses to copy books by hand. So you have all these people, these scribes and these monks writing for hours and hours, and sometimes they would get bored or frustrated, they just doodle in the margins. They'd be like, my hands hurt, or in Greek, or they'd be like, this is so annoying, why do I have to do this, or I'm hungry. And you'll get the look, so you're like, okay, so clearly these guys weren't always having the best day, so it's surprising there are more little discrepancies, but you know, they get tired, they're doing this by candlelight, and yet in spite of all that, we have relatively few inconsistencies, which is kind of cool.
Why couldn't I get a real job?
I know, exactly. Another night in the catacombs, transcribing again.
Yeah. So, now not all of these, I just want to be clear that not all of these manuscripts date nearly as far back as the first century. The ones that I've just showed you, 66, 46, and the other one, those are the oldest ones and they're partial. A lot of these date well into the following centuries, but the fact that we have all of these manuscripts and that they're spread out geographically, we can compare them and see where the differences are, and we can correct them. So the fact is that our Bible translations, as we do more and more archaeology and discover more manuscripts, our Bible translations are getting more accurate than getting worse. They're not getting worse, they're getting better. But the fact is, like I said, historical scholars agree that the New Testament was almost entirely written in the first century. Which means that they have to start putting dates on when these books were written. You know, if we have a manuscript of John that's somewhere in between 100 to 200 AD, and you can see like it's fairly well organized and laid out and structured, then we have to believe that at some point it had to have originated from somewhere, from someone at some time. And so these are the numbers that scholars put on these books. So you put Mark, like I said before, 66 to 70 AD, which is the earliest of the Gospels. Matthew and Luke are at 80 to 90 AD. John is a little later, 90 to 110 AD. And Revelation is in the middle there too, at 95 AD. Notice though that Paul's epistles are dated before the Gospels, which would be correct. Romans at 57, Corinthians 56, Galatians 55, Thessalonians 51, and John's epistles are in the Gospel of John.
By the way, Duran, those would be the more liberal dates.
They'd have to be pre 70 because of the destruction of Jerusalem, like Matthew and Luke especially. John definitely after, but I mean, I don't even know if like Bart Ehrman would date him that late, but maybe you're just trying to be super.
Bart Ehrman's a skeptic, and the last number I heard him say, and I heard it right out of his mouth, was he dated the Gospel of Mark in 50 AD.
Okay.
So
We're helping your case.
yeah, I'm just saying those are definitely the more liberal dates. The more conservative dates place at least Matthew, Mark, and Luke prior to 60 AD. And definitely place Acts prior to 63 to 60, because Paul and Peter both died in 65 or 66 AD, and the Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD, and Acts doesn't mention any of those events. And it's almost certainly that it would have if it had. So, and if Acts was written before 65 AD, then Luke would have also had to have been written before that time.
Yeah.
And since Luke copies almost the entire book of Mark, then Mark would have had to have been written before Luke. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, we're gonna move on in that direction.
Sorry to throw that in there, man.
No, it's all good. So at this point, we ask, can we trust the New Testament documents? And I would just like to say that there are many, the New Testament agrees with many archaeological finds and vice versa. We have archaeological finds that refer to Pontius Pilate, to Gallio as proconsul of Achaia, Erastus, the city treasurer, Romans 1623, Artemis Quirinius, Polytarchs of Thessalonica, Publius as governor of Malta, Lycaonian worship, Licinius as tetrarch of Abilene, and not to mention all of the historical facts that we've already discussed that were in the other historical documents about Jesus' teachings, his crucifixion, and his subsequent worship of him. All of this stuff, the New Testament agrees with all of this stuff.
Are you going to mention Gallio again?
Hmm?
Are you going to mention Gallio again? Number 2 on that? Because if you don't, I want to say the significance of him.
Go ahead. Yeah,
Okay.
because I can't remember if I do it.
Well, there's an inscription that they found that showed that lists his name, and they know that the position that he held was an annual position. That were one year turnover. That his position turned over, his proconsul turned over every year, and they date the inscription at 52 AD. So it is it is the most accurate date for pinpointing any of the dates in the New Testament, because it pinpoints Acts 18 is right after where Paul preaches to the Athenians on Mars Hill. And so it basically dates the book of 1 Corinthians. It is essentially what it does. It places it in around 56 AD and pinpoints it within a year.
Yeah.
So it's an extremely accurate dating tool.
So the point of all this is just that, like, we seem to be able to trust the New Testament, at least from a historical standpoint. This is important because a lot of times when we talk about whether or not we can trust the New Testament, you end up blurring the line between the theological stuff and the historical stuff. And obviously, as Christians, we believe all of it is historical per se. But for instance, we're probably not going to find, say, archaeological evidence that's going to point to Jesus telling the parable of the prodigal son. That's a purely theological quote. It doesn't have any direct connection except for Jesus himself to history. There's nothing to verify there. But these are verifiable names, places, and times in the New Testament. And this is a huge advantage over, well, all other religious texts. So let's move a little bit more into the Gospels themselves. Even if the Gospels were not written directly by their namesakes, they had to have been inspired by previous writing on their part by their namesakes. We know this because they build off of each other. There might have even been earlier sources hypothesized about as the Q source. In other words, there may have been sources that Mark gathered from and that Matthew and Luke gathered from that would have predated them, that would have been not necessarily like whole Gospels in and of themselves, but just maybe smaller writings that were being passed around quickly of the stories and saying Jesus. Yeah.
Was Q in the news recently? Did you think about that?
I don't know.
Someone purporting to have found it. You might have.
That was an April Fool's joke. That was an April Fool's joke.
Oh, thank God. I didn't click on it, so I didn't find out.
Oh yeah, I did see that. I didn't click on it either. Mostly because Q is I don't want to like mistake what Q is. Q is really just a hypothesis. This is what scholars will say. There is no like archaeological support for it. It's just kind of a theory of this is what we do with just knowing that the Gospels were probably drawing from other sources.
If
We
you
call it
Q is how to say it. Most of Mark is contained in Matthew and Luke, but there are some areas that Matthew and Luke share in common with one another that is not in Mark, and that's what they consider the Q source.
Yeah.
Q source is the source that they say Matthew and Luke drew upon that was not in Mark.
Right.
So that's specifically what they
So,
hypothesize.
when we think about what's in the New Testament, were they all crazy? Were they like fairly good historians? I mean, especially Luke, because Luke wrote Luke and Acts, and that's where we get a lot of these facts. And Paul included a lot of names and places in his writings as well, so obviously they were good
And
at.
traveled with Luke.
Yeah, and he traveled with Luke. So were they all crazy? Or were they legendized? And I want to explain that there is a difference between the Jesus myth and the Jesus legend. Because when skeptics say that they believe that Jesus was a myth, what they're actually saying is it flies completely in the face of everything that I've already said here tonight. They just don't believe that there's any historical basis that he actually existed at all, much less his disciples, except for whoever made it all up and started spreading it around. They basically just made up a myth. But there's a difference if you say that it was legendized, which is to say that, okay, we'll take all of this historical stuff into account. We'll say, okay, yes, Jesus was a real person, his disciples were real people, Jesus was probably even crucified, but this whole thing about resurrection and miracles and all of these sayings that we have in the New Testament, they were just all, the disciples just really embellished all of that stuff.
Like King Arthur.
Yeah.
King Arthur's probably a real person, but like more talk to our Arthurian legends.
Yeah.
Who grew up around it.
So, again, backing up, we have historical sources that give us a list of really important facts about Jesus and his life. Then we have the Gospels and the Pauline epistles that line up with those facts. Now what we want to know is all of the in-between stuff reliable as well. So, finally, we're going to actually open our Bibles. We're going to go to Galatians 1:11 through 2:10. I'm actually going to read all of it, but this is where Paul kind of tells the condensed version of his story. It tells about how he was persecuting the Christians, how Jesus met him on the road to Damascus, knocked him off his horse, called him to become a Christian, to stop persecuting the Christians. Paul didn't go to the apostles right away, but he went to Arabia, and then he went back to Damascus, and then finally after 3 years, he actually went to Jerusalem to see Peter, of all people, where he remained with him for 15 days, and as Gary Habermas likes to say, they probably talked about more than the weather. It's worth noting that the reason why he took 3 years, the reason why he probably stalled, is because he was known as a persecutor. We know this from the book of Acts. From what Luke wrote about him in the book of Acts, he was very early on, almost as soon as the Christians started taking root and doing their thing. It says the young man Saul was right there, and he would hold people's coats and stuff while they would go throw rocks at Stephen and all that. And so it took a while for people to really accept him, and I'm sure that Peter probably heard about him beforehand.
He also had a few things to sort out in his own life too.
Yeah. He also needed to be healed of his temporary blindness, and he was baptized by Ananias, a different Ananias. Then he met James, Jesus' brother, who was already converted at that point as well, because James was a doubter. I think this is the first time I've mentioned James here, but it's mentioned in the Gospels that James, Jesus' brothers, as well as Jesus' other brothers, they didn't believe Jesus. They doubted him. They didn't believe his ministry or anything like that. I even actually kind of wonder like, no offense to my Catholic friends, but I actually kind of wonder, like, what Mary thought of him as well, because she seems rather, I guess she follows him around, and it does say that when he was young, she kept these things in her heart that the angels had said to her, and she knew that, she gave birth to him as a virgin. But I wonder about that. That's besides the point. Paul met James, then he went to Syria and Cilicia, and after 14 more years, he went to Jerusalem again with Barnabas and Titus, and then eventually he had an argument with Peter in Antioch about table manners, which is where when you catch your church father, elbow on the table. It was a bit more complicated than that. But I just want to ask, this is all in Galatians. This is what Paul supposedly wrote in Galatians. I just want to ask, does that sound like legend? Or does it sound like history? Does it sound like something that someone who's trying to write legends about what he believes would write? He would just write about all his little
I kind of
travels.
hope it'd be a little cooler.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really boring story.
I mean, he could have at least said, and I rode a flaming dragon to Jerusalem. That would have been more fun. Let's see. All right, moving on. So what was Paul preaching? Well, now we go to 1 Corinthians chapter 15. He writes, "For I delivered to you, first of all, that which I also received." He's telling the Corinthians, I gave you, the Corinthians, what I received first, which is that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he was seen by Cephas, then by the 12. Scholars have identified this as a creed of the early church. And there are several reasons for those. I'm not going to get into all of that. But one of them is just like he referred to Peter as Cephas. Like, just notice that in Galatians, he refers to Peter as Peter, and then in Corinthians, he refers to him as Cephas. This was to say that referring to him as Cephas was how Jesus referred to Peter, and so as such, it became part of the creed, and it's not what Paul would have called Peter just personally. So, but he also adds on, after that he was seen by over 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain to the present, but some have fallen asleep. After that he was seen by James, which is his brother, then by all the apostles, then last of all he was seen by me also, as by one born out of due time. Again, does it sound like legend? I mean, does it sound like somebody who's trying to embellish things? Or does it sound like somebody who's really trying to write facts about what he experienced, what he did, what he saw? And I just want to emphasize too that, like, when we look at literature that comes from around this same time, we can see a difference between fiction and history, between the way that somebody would write fictional writings and how they would write history. And I mean, scholars agree that this is not. They might be able to still hold to kind of the legend idea that maybe Paul was operating on ideas that were embellished and then handed down to him. But we can at least say that Paul himself was very sincere about what he believed, and obviously what he considers to have happened to him on the road to Damascus. So when did he convert? It's dated to around 55 to 56. 1 Corinthians is dated to the Galatians is around 55. Of course, those are probably still literal numbers.
No, those are the generally accepted numbers by everybody, believe it or not.
Yeah. So according to the rough timeline in Acts, it's kind of hard to measure, but it would be that Paul's conversion would happen about 2 years after the crucifixion. And I just want to emphasize too that this was a life-changing experience for Saul/Paul, and that choosing to step away from his upbringing as a Jew and become a Christian was a very dangerous thing for him to do. He of all people knew the risks of continuing to be a Christian because he was the one who was going out hunting Christians. And for him to literally go from the hunter to the hunted was a major step, and one of the reasons why we take Paul so seriously. So, speaking of the date of the crucifixion,
Yeah, 33. April 3rd.
yeah, it's really important.
Yeah.
So,
33.
it just so happens that we're like right in the middle of this possible Easter. We're right in the middle of Easter week right now, whether it happened in 30 or 33. There are debates. I'm not sure which way I'd be personally. I've read both sides, and it's really hard to decipher. On the one hand, I think that 33 AD is a good number because of what's written in John, and I'm not going to go into what's slightly different about John because it can be kind of confusing and it's a bit of a can of worms. But the fact is that there are only two options, and it has to do with the 14th day of Nisan in the Jewish lunar calendar. That only leaves us two possibilities within the reign of Pilate, and it's either the 7th of April, 30 AD, or the 3rd of April, 33 AD.
Yeah, it depends on whether you believe Jesus was crucified on Friday or
Yeah.
on Wednesday.
Yeah.
That's the difference between those 2 days.
And there's a contention. There's also the can of worms is was Jesus having was the Last Supper a Passover meal or was it not? So we know when the crucifixion was, whereabouts. Note that this is not enough time for legend. If the crucifixion happened in 30 or 33 AD, and then of course the resurrection happens, 3 days later, or 2 days later. And then Paul's conversion happens, 2 years after that? And then Paul meets Peter 35 to 38, and then Galatians and Corinthians are being written 55 to 56. There's no time for a legend to develop. There's no one for it to exchange hands with. The creed that's in 1 Corinthians, if Paul got that, let's say he got it from Peter in 35 to 33, that means that the creed would have already had to have been in circulation before he got it. And Paul knew that he was talking to the eyewitnesses of the resurrected Jesus. That's why he went to talk to them. So the fact is that there's just not time for legend to develop. In fact, and I think William Lane Craig makes this point really well. Do I have that quote actually? Let's see. Yeah, this is what William Lane Craig writes about the legend of Jesus insofar as how legends develop. He says, in fact, adding a time gap of 2 generations to Jesus' death lands you in the 2nd century, just when the apocryphal Gospels begin to appear. These do contain all sorts of fabulous stories about Jesus, trying to fill in the years between his boyhood and his starting his ministry, for example. These are the obvious legends sought by the critics, not the biblical Gospels. So what William Lane Craig is saying is, yeah, of course there are legends about Jesus that aren't true.
I got your legends right here.
Exactly. And we know exactly when they were written. They were written in the 2nd century. We call them the apocryphal Gospels, the Gospel of Thomas, and so on. And we don't trust them because we know that they came from the 2nd century. And we know that the early Christians didn't like them. So, nothing that Paul wrote contradicted the Gospels or Acts or vice versa. Therefore, since we have good reason to trust Paul, we can at least trust the Gospels and Acts, basic historical facts, including the conversion of James, Jesus' brother. I don't know why, but it seems like painters, I looked at pictures of James. They all made him look exactly like Jesus.
I mean,
He does look pretty
Yeah, I mean, it was his brother, I guess, but it's just, gosh. Okay.
But he probably didn't have long hair, though.
Yeah, probably wouldn't want him to look too much like Jesus. A lot of people were probably looking for him. But let's just consider, okay, let's try to be objective here, because I know that probably most of us are already Christians here, but what if Paul was just crazy? And what if the disciples were liars? And what if Paul's craziness, the disciples were just like, oh yeah, he's on our side. Like what if, let's just say the disciples, they were just these mean liars and they just wanted to spread these legends or these myths, whatever they were concocting. And then all of a sudden one day, Saul falls backwards off his horse and hits his head and sees the light and hears a voice, and then 3 years later he tracks down Peter and says, Peter, I saw him, I saw Jesus. And Peter's secretly like laughing to himself, just like, he actually believes us. And then they just let Paul loose and he like did all the rest of the work for them. Like what if that was really what happened? So how can we trust that what the disciples believed was true? I mean, if we assume that we can't trust Paul in that respect, how can we know that the accounts in the Gospels came from the disciples, and how can we trust them? What if Paul just had some kind of psychoneurotic episode, and Paul's testimony only fed the flames? Okay, so here's our first line of evidence. The Gospels are humiliating. Now, let's imagine that you want to make up a great myth about yourself and your great leader. Would you include details such as that your great leader's family didn't believe in him, or that there were certain places where he couldn't perform miracles, or that people really didn't like him that much, or that he might have had a demon? Are these the kinds of things you would want included in your gospel about your great leader? Well, these are the kinds of things that are in the Gospels. Jesus had a bad reputation for the company he kept. The disciples consistently asked stupid questions.
My favorite.
The disciples behaved rashly and rudely, sometimes violently. I mean, who would, if Peter was trying to make himself look good, would he say that, yeah, I pulled out a sword and chopped off that dude's ear, but Jesus told me to put it away, so we can't do that anymore, guys. Judas Iscariot betrayed Jesus. He was one of them. He was probably their friend, and they threw him under the bus. Most of the disciples ran away, including Peter. You know, he was kind of an important guy. He ran away, denied Jesus 3 times. That's in, I'm sure it's in all 4 of the Gospels. And, no offense, but women were the first to discover the empty tomb, and women's testimony was just no good back then. So why would they even bother saying that women were the first ones to discover the empty tomb? Why would they even bother? And I have verses affiliated with all of these. Here's my, also, because J. Warner Wallace, this is my second point, why we can trust the Gospels. I'm just gonna, I'm gonna spoil God's Not Dead 2 for you, because I saw it the other day.
Sorry, go ahead.
I'm gonna spoil it for you. Because this was the best part. This was the only good, it wasn't even the best part, it was the only good part. And that was when J. Warner Wallace took the stand and they specifically asked him about.
Did he play himself?
Yes, he played himself. Yes, and this is his line from the movie. Mr. Kane, I'm afraid you misunderstand. When I started my study, I was a devout atheist. I approached the Gospels as a committed skeptic, not a believer. I'm not a Christian today because I was raised that way or because it satisfies some need to accomplish some goal. I'm simply a Christian because it's evidentially true. And then what he does is he leans over and he asks the judge to give him the Bible that's on the stand. This in front of the judge, which is actually kind of funny because the judge is supposedly an atheist. He's one of the mean atheists. And the judge looks at the Bible like, oh, I didn't even realize that was there, but then he hands it to him. And then J. Warner Wallace pulls out this is in the movie, he pulls out this example, this discrepancy between Matthew and Luke. And what he's actually saying is that these so-called contradictions or discrepancies between the Gospels actually help our case because according to him, being a professional detective, he understands how eyewitness testimony really works. And he understands that when there are differences between your eyewitness testimony, sometimes it can actually help you out. And he actually points to this case of Jesus being slapped in the face because in Matthew 26, verses 67 through 68, all it says is that after Jesus had been arrested, people started slapping him in the face, and then they said, prophesy to us, who slapped you? Well, that seems kind of strange. If I slapped you in the face and then I asked you who slapped you, you'd say, well, you did. right? So that doesn't really make much sense, but actually the corroborating detail that we're looking for is in Luke, and Luke actually says they blindfolded Jesus, and then they slapped him, and then they asked him to prophesy. So the fact that these two different accounts had contradictory details actually ended up helping us out. The same thing is actually true of Judas returning his bribe money. In Matthew, it says that he just walked into the temple and threw it on the ground and went out and hanged himself. But in Acts, it says that Judas went out and bought a field and then hanged himself in the field. So there seems to be an apparent contradiction here, but actually it's just two different angles on the same story, because what happened, what we know actually happened was that from I think it was one of the other Gospels, was that what happened was Judas came in and he threw the money on the ground, and then the priests used the money to buy a field because it was blood money and they didn't want to keep it for themselves there, so they went out and bought a field, and then Judas wouldn't hang himself in the field. So J. Warner Wallace argues that this actually helps and supports us, and as many scholars like to point out the so-called contradiction between the Gospels about the pesky angels. Like, how many of them were they? Were they inside or were they outside the tomb? What did they do? And J. Warner Wallace has a whole page of what J. Warner Wallace wrote about that. But the fact that he took this long controversy and he reduced it to 3 paragraphs, I think it's worth reading. I can send you the link if you want. The fact is as he says, his point is that because the gospel writers could have made an attempt to make it all fit together, he says that if they had done that, Wallace says that if the gospel writers had actually worked hard to make sure that all their gospel accounts matched, he would actually not take them as seriously. And the fact that they didn't do so, even though they could have, helps him out. He says this lack of effort to make the accounts match is yet another evidence, in my view, of their reliability. As I said in my last post, when people have the opportunity to align their statements, yet still refuse to do so, I know I am getting the nuanced observations I need to properly investigate the case. The gospel authors certainly had the opportunity to change the descriptions to make sure they matched, but they refused to do so. As a result, we can have even more confidence in the reliability of these accounts. They display the level of variation I would expect to see if they were true, reliable eyewitness descriptions. And then he clarifies, there were 2 angels at the tomb of Jesus. One rolled away the stone, and then both helped Jesus from the tomb. The gospel accounts describe the angels in response to the specific questions and actions under consideration in each gospel. There is no contradiction in the New Testament accounts. There were 2 angels. Enough. All right. Also, good evidence that the Gospels are reliable are transmission of the Gospels. The Jews were really good at copying their manuscripts. They just were, and their oral traditions were exquisite as well. Even if the Gospels had been compiled and written like later on, like with the liberal dates, the textual evidence still indicates that the eyewitness testimonies were left intact and untouched despite supposed inconsistencies, like I just went over. Let me see here. The other thing to remember about, well, now that we can be fairly sure that what's written in the Gospels is actually authentic and reliable eyewitness testimony that has survived the ages, and we still have it. Now we just need to know, well, okay, how seriously did the disciples take this question?
Well, what about John? Why isn't John in this? I mean, I know it's not a
Well,
I know
because-
it's not a synoptic gospel, but
Because
there's
it-
overlap with John.
There is, but it came later. It just did. It's nothing against John. I mean, John is just as reliable as well. It just came later because he wrote it late in life. But the apostles died for their belief. These are approximate dates. Some of these are more traditional and less historically historically reliable. And when we say traditional, what we mean is that the tradition was passed on in the church, which is to say that we don't really have good outside the church sources to confirm some of these things, but some of them are actually really very good, namely Paul and Peter. Peter was crucified. He was definitely crucified. He might have been crucified upside down because he didn't want to be crucified exactly like Jesus was. That was around 64 AD. Paul was beheaded by Nero in 67 AD. James was actually the first of them to go. He was killed by the sword by Agrippa, and I believe that's actually mentioned in the book of Acts in 44 to 45 AD.
So that's James, the brother of Jesus?
No, it's a different James. James,
brother of John.
yeah, James, brother of John.
James.
There's so many James. There's also James the Lesser, who had his head beaten.
James, the brother of Jesus, was thrown off the temple roof.
Was it
It's also kind of a legend that they tried to boil him in oil and kill him, but supposedly he didn't die from being boiled in oil, so he was exiled into Patmos, which is where he wrote Revelation. The point of this is that the disciples, they died for what they believed. And most of them died within 30 to 40 years after the crucifixion happened and after supposedly the resurrection happened. So the fact that they took this serious enough that they were not even willing to denounce their gods, as our other historical references said, the fact that they were not willing to denounce their other gods, but they stuck to their claims that Jesus was God, that they worshipped him, that they would gather every week and sing hymns and eat and pray and worship together. They were not willing to give up any of that. They were not willing to give up that truth. And
they didn't exactly die easy deaths either.
no, they didn't. No, they didn't. And of course, some skeptics like to point out, well, we don't know if they actually maintained their belief up to the point of death. But the fact is that we know that Christians were being persecuted as early as 64 AD.
And we know that
The
they
fact
were
that
being
they-
spared if they renounced.
Yes, exactly. So these guys, they would have known that. They would have known.
And the Romans would have pounced on that. One of the leaders renouncing, they would have killed them.
Oh yes, that is it's actually a very good point. That if any of the Roman leaders had found one who actually denounced them, they probably wouldn't have even killed them. They probably would have
Blow
said,
the house.
Paraded him around and
yeah, exactly. They would have said, hey, this guy says it's all false, so you Christians just need to chill out. But it didn't. They all died. Good reason to believe that they all died. All of this stuff that we've been discussing up until now is very strictly historical, and most scholars agree on pretty much the bulk of what we're saying. Even the renowned skeptic Dr. Bart Ehrman would agree with much of what's been said here tonight about what happened and the characters involved and the events involved. But of course, Bart Ehrman doesn't believe in the resurrection. But there is another historical fact that is less attested by a lot of historical scholars, but there is still good historical precedence for it, which was that the tomb was empty. It's the most contested historical fact. But if it wasn't empty, I feel like we wouldn't be having this discussion.
Polaroid in there.
Huh?
It was a Polaroid.
Yes, it was empty of everything except the Shroud of Turin. Which is why I put this picture in there. Because he saw that and he was like, what? But, and then he turned around and he was like, because Jesus was there. But,
Jesus photo bomb.
actually, I'm not sure if it was or not.
White Jesus.
But, actually, you probably couldn't see the image on the shroud at the time, which is one thing that the movie Risen gets wrong. But the fact that it's in there is really cool. The reason that this fact is disputed, actually, one of the bigger reasons, and I have to confess, and it's actually it's almost kind of a bothersome detail. It still kind of bothers me sometimes too, and it's that Paul specifically doesn't seem to make a big deal of the empty tomb. He definitely talks about Jesus' resurrection. He definitely believed it was a bodily resurrection, but he never directly references the empty tomb. But there are plenty of arguments from scholars that he didn't need to. To them, it was a no. You know, today, if you heard the story, we would be like, oh, well, we need to go to the tomb, we need to take some forensic evidence, we need to take some pictures and all of that. But for them, they walked in, he wasn't there, they took the shroud, and they were like, okay, well, they left the tomb. And I've had somewhat extensive debates with atheists before about, well, why didn't the Christians venerate the tomb? Or, you know, why didn't they decorate it and say this was the tomb of the risen Lord? Huh?
Because he's not there.
Yeah, he wasn't there. They had bigger things to worship, namely like Jesus himself. And Jesus was walking around. He was going around everywhere. He was meeting people. Yeah, exactly. And the other thing too is that even if they did venerate the tomb, honestly, it probably would have been lost or destroyed, because when Jerusalem was sacked later on, they just wiped out everything. They just took everything.
Disciples were also driven from.
And they had to run.
They weren't.
It's not like they could just all go out to the tomb every Sunday and worship there, because there were probably Romans there waiting for them, waiting in the tomb to pop out, you know, which would have been really clever of them, I know.
But there are two locations where they say where the tomb is.
Yeah.
I'm not sure whether either one is exactly correct, but there are two locations.
Yeah, and that would be cool to look into. But fact is, I mean, the tomb was empty. If it wasn't empty, somebody would have produced a body. Okay, so what we have here are 12 facts. This is a summary of basically all the facts that we have gone over so far and tested to historically. These are summarized by Dr. Gary Habermas, whose book I read. These are his 12 facts. Jesus died by crucifixion. He was buried. His death caused the disciples to despair and lose hope. The tomb was empty, which is contested. The disciples had experiences which they believed were literal appearances of the risen Jesus. The fact that they believed it is the most important proof on this list. Number 5. Number 6, the disciples were transformed from doubters to bold proclaimers. The resurrection was the central message of what they believed. Remember, it was called in one of the historical sources the mischievous superstition. They preached the message of Jesus' resurrection in Jerusalem. The church was born and grew. They expanded really fast. Orthodox Jews who believed in Christ made Sunday their primary day of worship. It's really important because it was different than the Jewish Sabbath. James was converted to the faith when he saw the resurrected Jesus. James was a family skeptic, and Paul was converted to the faith. Paul was an outsider skeptic. So, we have these facts, and we have to explain what caused them. The resurrection seems to be the best explanation for these facts. So what we're going to do now is we're going to try to come up with other theories that might be able to explain these facts. We're going to try. Y'all work hard with me, okay. I'm going to go over some of the popular ones, then we're going to give it a shot. The swoon theory was that Jesus didn't die. He didn't even die. He was crucified, yeah, maybe he passed out. Okay, they stabbed him in the side. But they laid him in the tomb, and he woke up one day, and yeah, the disciples saw him woken up, right? And then they said, "Oh, it's our resurrected king." Well, what's the problem with this? I mean, realistically.
He's stabbed in the side.
Yeah, he's bleeding from every part of his body.
The water too that came out.
Yeah. And the point is that the fact is that just based on the Gospels, and especially if you include the Shroud of Turin as evidence against this, there is really strong medical evidence that Jesus was dead. Like, he was straight up dead. He was dead for 3 days. They wrapped him up, they laid him in the tomb. Yeah, they didn't have fancy medical instruments to tell them whether his heart had actually stopped beating or whether he was actually brain dead or what. But the swoon theory, it was, I don't remember exactly when the earliest that it was proposed, but it's just, it hasn't stood the test of time at all, especially as our forensic evidence of the Bible gets interpreted more as well. The imposition theory is that the disciples stole the body and then they made up everything about the resurrection. But what's the problem with this?
500 witnesses.
In Matthew?
Yeah, that's one of the problems. Yeah, that's one of the problems.
In Matthew, they mostly guards.
They died by
Yeah, why would they have died for something they just made up?
And they didn't exactly become like super rich off it or anything. Like,
Yeah, there wasn't any money to
Opposite
make.
of rich.
I think, what is it? Oh man, I leave that out. J. Warner Wallace says that there are always three reasons why people will lie about something, and it's either to get power, to get money, or to get sex. Those are the three reasons. And the disciples didn't get any of that from making up these crazy stories about their resurrected king. So it's just not a good thing. Okay, then there's the hallucination theory, which, like, props to whoever finally thought this up. The disciples all hallucinated the resurrected Jesus. So Mary Magdalene goes to the tomb and she hallucinates, and then she runs back to the disciples, and then they run out to the tomb, and then they run back, and they're all so darn tired from all that running back and forth that then they start hallucinating the resurrected Savior. And keep in mind, though, too, I mean, let's be serious, they were grieving. They were grieving really hard, and sometimes when you grieve really hard, you see crazy things, like God. So, and then a bunch of other people, like 500 other people, they hallucinated too. And then a couple of years later, Paul fell off his horse and hallucinated as well.
And it was always the exact same hallucination.
Yeah, exactly. It's really crazy. I mean, I don't know what they were cooking. I don't know what they were cooking. But does this really account for everything, though? Does that account at all for the reason why the tomb was empty? No. Yeah. Does it account for the growth of the church? Would people have actually followed a group of people who were just hallucinating? I mean, surely at some point the disciples were like, Jesus! And everybody's going, what are you doing? You know? So it doesn't really explain all the facts. Okay, then there's Jesus' twin brother theory, which was that Jesus had a twin brother. Now, he did have brothers, and if they looked anything like James, I guess you could say, I mean, maybe one of his brothers walked out one day and everybody was just so struck with grief that when they saw him, they just fell all over him. And
It's the most elaborate human parent trap that's ever been.
Yeah. So, but let's look at our list of explanations. Does that explain why the tomb was empty? No. Does that explain why the church was born and grew? No. Does that explain the conversion of Paul? Did Jesus' twin brother like jump out of the bushes and kick Paul off his horse? No. Then there's the conspiracy theory, which was that the disciples just deceived everybody with myths. They were just trying to make everything up. They stole the body. They threw it off somewhere else. But then again, the problem here is that they would have been lying, and they wouldn't have died for a lie. And the classic thing to say at this point is that people will die for what they believe in. It happens all the time. But people will not die for what they know to be a lie. They just won't. We have terrorists all over the world who will gladly blow themselves up in kamikaze fashion to go to heaven, but they just have a belief. They're not really sure if what they believe is true. If they had, we would think it unusual if they knew for sure that their faith was not true, and they went and blew themselves up anyway. We would be like, no, you're just crazy. But whether you look at it as crazy in kind of a brilliant sense, like, oh, they were crazy to make all of this up and it worked, or crazy as in they were just all lunatics who conspired together and just really enjoyed writing fan fiction about their king. I mean, which is basically what it would have been. So that doesn't explain our facts. So let's just like give it a try. Everybody's doing it these days. Let's try and come up with some kind of explanation that would explain. And you feel free to combine any combination of these that you possibly can. Does anybody want to give it a shot? Because it's actually kind of fun.
All of history was made up by the Illuminati.
Okay. Can that explain? No, let's like seriously, like take it seriously. Can that explain why there are Christians around today?
The Illuminati is really good.
I guess.
Really bad.
What if I don't believe in any miracle whatsoever? I said, no, it might not be any of those things, but it definitely wasn't the resurrection. It definitely wasn't the actual resurrection.
Right. Okay, so that's good. Thanks for setting me up. That is what Bart Ehrman says. When it comes down to it, the skeptic Bart Ehrman, I mean, he's a historian. He's a historian of historians. He would not dispute any of these facts, except perhaps that the tomb was empty. Maybe, but it would be a stretch even for him. But he definitively says, I think one of his famous quotes is, and he's a skeptic, so it matters, but he says, Jesus existed whether we like it or not. But this is what he says. He says, fine, all of these things happened, and maybe we can't come up with a good explanation of it, but the fact is that if you make up a list of possible explanations, a miracle will always be the least possible explanation. Therefore, it is not the possibility that we should use.
That's not a theory or an explanation so much as it's a philosophical prior commitment.
Exactly. It's
Just
a philosophy.
it's an a priori assumption.
Exactly.
It's question begging.
Exactly. It says, no, I can't find, I just don't believe in miracles in general, therefore I can't accept any reason to believe that this miracle happened, even though what we're doing is we're looking at we're looking at this and we're saying, what can explain this?
It's basically just repackaged Hume. Just David Hume.
Yeah.
Just they're 20%.
And the funny thing is, though, is that when people say, okay, well, what are some of your better explanations, Bart? And like William Lane Craig did, there's a great debate. He said something like, Bart Ehrman said, oh, I can come up with dozens of them. And then he said,
I'm not saying it's aliens.
oh, I forgot to include that.
It's aliens.
But he said something like, okay, how about the disciples, they stole the body, not because they wanted to deceive anybody, but because they felt like, let's say they felt like for some reason he deserved a better place of burial or a more secretive place of burial than Joseph of Arimathea's tomb. So they went and buried him somewhere else. And then as their grief persisted, they began to talk amongst themselves and somehow come to the conclusion that maybe he had been resurrected and that they didn't necessarily see him. That was kind of an embellished detail that happened later on. So they went around saying that even though he had been crucified and he was dead, that possibly he had been resurrected, and that people started taking him seriously, and they really liked Jesus, and Jesus did say some good things, so it was easy to go along with. And then eventually it kind of got out of hand, and by the time the disciples died, the embellishments got to a point where, for some reason, they rested in this kind of thing where we can't really say for sure what happened, but it was something really blurry and ambiguous like that happened. Can anybody tell me what's wrong what I just said, why that wouldn't work. Sure.
Maybe 11 and 12, Paul being converted and James being converted when he saw resurrected Jesus.
Maybe James, because he was already a skeptic according to the Gospels, but maybe that was an embellished detail. But definitely Paul. This is why Paul is important, is because he corroborates with the disciples. It's like the disciples have their experiences and they write the Gospels and they come up with this stuff. And then Paul has this completely separate experience. And I just want to say, from like a Christian standpoint, it's remarkable that God would have planned that God would have made that happen. Because now that we have these two groups of people, and when I say groups of people, I mean like the people that Paul was directly involved with, like even Luke, because Luke wasn't one of the original apostles. That they would have each other to basically be a system of checks and balances with each other historically, and getting the facts straight is remarkable. And that's one of the things that Mark Urban fails to take into consideration. He would have to make up an equally, I mean, if he thought that what I just said before was really blurry and ambiguous, he would have to make up something just as ambiguous about Paul, because we just don't know what in the world would cause Paul to leave his comfortable life of killing people and taking it easy. I mean, following his religious laws, obviously, but like, why would he throw that all away to become the hunted instead of the hunter? I mean, exactly, it's a profound dilemma. I just want to say that I think that the best explanation for these facts, obviously, is the resurrection. Is the resurrection of Jesus. It's the only detail that can make sense of all of these things happening. It's the only reason why, it's the only possible reason why we can take the disciples seriously. It's the only possible reason we can take Paul seriously, because he took them seriously. The fact that we know that Jesus really existed and he really was crucified and he really was buried, and that the tomb really was probably empty, otherwise we wouldn't be having this discussion. It just makes the resurrection, that the defense of the resurrection rests on this point. I hope that nobody was expecting there to be some kind of like empirical, you can touch it, you can feel it type proof tonight of the resurrection, but the fact is that the hole that it leaves in history without it is not just a little pinhole. It would be a huge gaping hole in at least the history of history since 2,000 years ago, 1,983 years ago.
Western civilization.
Western civilization, because this was, the church was born and grew. What would history even look like without the Christian church? I mean, would we all still be Jews? What would it look like?
You'd be a Viking or something.
I would eat the fried chickens or whatever. So, but there is one other line of evidence here too, and that's when we take this story and we move it into chapter 2, which is the early church fathers. These were the guys who knew the guys that we've been talking about: Clement, Ignatius, Quadratus, Barnabas, Justin Martyr. These guys didn't just write about the disciples, they knew them. They worked with them, they preached with them, they traveled with them, they shook hands with them, they laughed, they cried, they saw movies together. So, I have some quotes here from some of them. Clement was an elder of Rome. He wrote a letter to the Corinthian church in 95 AD that said, "The apostles received the gospel for us from the Lord Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ was sent forth from God. So then Christ is from God, and the apostles are from Christ. Both therefore came of the will of God in the appointed order. Having therefore received a charge, and having been fully assured through the resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ, and confirmed in the word of God with full assurance of the Holy Ghost, they went forth with the glad tidings that the kingdom of God should come. So preaching everywhere in country and town, they appointed their first fruits, when they had proved them by the Spirit to be bishops and deacons unto them that should believe. Justin Martyr wrote in 150 AD to Emperor Antonius Pius. And note that, like, once we get to these points, these guys are fairly, really well documented. Accordingly, after he, Jesus, was crucified, even all his acquaintances forsook him, having denied him. And afterwards, when he had risen from the dead and appeared to them, and had taught them to read the prophecies in which all these things were foretold as coming to pass, and when they had seen him ascending into heaven, and had believed, and had received power sent thence by him upon them, and went to every race of men, they taught these things and were called apostles. Then he wrote to Trypho, in dialogue with Trypho in 150 AD. For indeed the Lord remained upon the tree almost until evening, and they buried him at eventide. Then on the third day he rose again. And that was the second generation of Christians who knew the disciples. And then they passed this knowledge on to the next generation, the next generation, the next generation. And here we are, 1,980 something years later, and here I am talking to you in the same tradition of the early church fathers, telling you that Jesus is Lord, that he's resurrected, that he's alive again, that he died and he was resurrected. And he died specifically to take our sins away. And if we accept that gift from him, we will have eternal life, be forgiven, and be resurrected with him eventually. This is one of my favorite pictures.